Welcome. I had a question about subsidized debt and how to handle it. So I constructed this rather simple example which I think will help people. So let's start with this sort of unsubsidized debt cost. And let's make this is an APV analysis. So we need an unlevered cost of capital, which I made 11%. We need an interest rate, a required rate of return to debt holders, and I made that 8%. Let's assume that the time period is 5 years, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the amount of debt every year is 5 years. I estimated, put in here an unlevered cash flow every year, and estimated interest, which is just 8% times 500, as you can see, 8% times 500 here. And so it's interest of 40 every year. Then the tax shield is just the interest times the tax rate, which I assumed here to be 40%. Then I took the present value of the unlevered cash flows, at 11%, and that gave me 376. Next, I took the present value of the tax shield, that's the 16 each year, and I took the present value of that at 8%, which is the required rate of return to debt, and wound up with an enterprise value of $444. Okay, so now let's go over and let's assume that in fact there is subsidized debt, and the subsidy for the debt is that they're able to borrow at 6% and not 8%. Now this would be equivalent to, for example, a company making the investment and getting an industrial revenue bond from the county or the state, which allowed them to borrow the money at a lower rate. And so what does that mean? Well, basically the unlevered cash flows would stay exactly the same. The interest expense now would not be 40 but 30, which is 6% times 500. And the tax shield from that would be just the interest of 30 times the tax rate of 40%, so it would be 12. So the tax shield is lower, and the present value of the unlevered cash flows is still at 11%. That's the same in each case. Now, but the present value of the tax shield is 47 and not 64. And the enterprise value given with the firm receiving a subsidy on its debt is less than with what it is without the subsidy. That seems strange, but on the surface, if we do an APV analysis, this whole analysis over here sort of looks right. We took the value of the unlevered cash flows, we took the present value of the tax shields, and we got the enterprise value. The problem is that we're missing something in the subsidized debt costs case, and that is we're not incorporating the fact that the company is really getting a subsidy. It's exactly the same thing as if what I had done over here. The firm would be paying 40, but it pays 30 itself, but receives a subsidy of 10 because of the 2%, the lower subsidized rate, 2% versus 6% versus 8%. So the subsidy is actually 2% times the amount of debt, which is 10 every year. The after-tax subsidy, value of the subsidy, is basically whatever the subsidy was times 1 minus the tax rate, because it would have been paying 10 in interest, but they're not. And so the after-tax savings is just the subsidy times 1 minus the tax rate. And so now we get the present value of the after-tax subsidy, which is 8%, which I discounted at 8%, is 23. And the total enterprise value that incorporates the present value of the unlevered cash flows, the present value of the tax shield, plus the present value of the after-tax subsidy winds up being 448, and which is gratefully larger than the 440 over here. And the point of this discussion was to make you aware that sometimes when we do an APV, it can look right. We took the unlevered value of the unlevered cash flows plus the value of the subsidy, but in this particular case, it's a demonstration that we need to capture the full flows of the firm, and so we'd actually, if we're talking about the enterprise value, we'd have to also incorporate the value of what the tax shelter is, tax subsidy is, which is the saving of 10 in interest every period, and saving in the after-tax subsidy winds up being that. And so we wind up with a total value of 448 versus a value if the firm had was unsubsidized at 440. This should make more sense to you, and the fact that a subsidy has some value.